With the release of the new Imperial Guard kits, I was incredibly keen to corrupt them in some way. Chaos seemed like the obvious choice, and I'm sure I'll get around to them at some point, but this time I fancied dipping in the Xenos side of things to build a Genestealer Cult Guardsman. For this kitbash, I imagined a world where the cult had overthrown the humans, but, for whatever reason, hadn't been absorbed by a hive fleet, giving the cult the full access to the world's military supplies. To build a trooper from this world, I began by removing and cleaning up the parts to build a standard bearer from the new command squad, before gluing together the torso and the legs. The usual flag carried by the standard bearer would be replaced by one befitting the cult, and so it needed to be removed. To get a fine, straight cut, my knife was used to remove the flag at the seam between it and the banner pole. From here, the tip of the banner pole was flattened out. The standard would be replaced with one of the Neophyte Hybrid's cult icons. I could have simply done a complete arm swap here, but I preferred the full military look. The icon was removed from the banner pole using clippers, making the cut just above the hand before again trimming flat the base. To combine the two parts of the banner, and to give the structure a little more rigidity, a pin would be used. A 1mm hole was drilled into both the banner pole and the icon. This was done very carefully due to the narrow diameter of the pole itself. Into one of the holes, some 1mm plastic rod was glued and cut down, so just a small amount was left protruding. Finally, the two halves were glued together, with the rod acting as a pin between them. I could have used some metal here instead. Either would help to increase the strength of the bond. The now completed banner was then glued to the torso. The head was another part that was sourced from the Neophyte Hybrid kit, and actually scaled really well with the new Cadian torsos. The neck was a little too big though, and so needed to be cut back. Clippers were used to remove the bulk of the width and the height. After a quick comparison to see how things were lining up, more trims were made until the head was sitting properly in the neck and could be glued into place. Normally, the 4th generation head would have allowed this hybrid to infiltrate its way into human society. However, in a world controlled entirely by the cult, having more extreme mutations wouldn't be quite as problematic. To represent this, the claw of a cult acolyte was removed, making the cut just past the wrist. Similarly, another cut was made to another arm from the Cadian Command Squad kit. Both parts were cleaned up and flattened before the two were glued together. In order to smooth out the rather blunt joint between the human and the mutated arm, some green stuff was mixed up. This was rolled out into a fine roll and wrapped around the joint. Then, using a combination of metal and rubber tools, a series of folds and creases were added, using the existing folds in the cloth as a guide. For this whole process, I used Vaseline to help prevent the putty from sticking to my tools, and to give it a smoother finish. Just give it a wipe once the putty is cured, and you should have no problems in painting over it. To finish off the model, it was glued to the base alongside a dead animal bit that had been clipped in half so it looked buried, and with that, the model was ready for painting. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Wormwood. Wormwood are creators of high quality and thoughtful accessories for your favourite RPGs and board games, and last year they teamed up with Dispel to bring you one of the biggest dice campaigns in Kickstarter history. This year they are back with the Elemental Collection. The Elemental Collection is a carefully curated series of dice and dice vaults inspired by 6 elements: fire, water, foliage, geode, space, and lightning. Each of these elements is represented by 2 sets of dice, precisely cast by Dispel, and 2 handcrafted dice vaults, expertly crafted by Wormwood. So regardless of where your adventures take you, be it the lush plains and treacherous forests of a fantasy world, the dimly lit alleys of a cursed city, or the deepest depths of space aboard a city-side ship, the Elemental Collection will accompany you in style. If you are interested in grabbing some of these beautifully cast dice and expertly crafted vaults, then you can join the Kickstarter campaign that is currently running. But hurry, there isn't long left to be among the first to receive these stunning accessories, as the campaign ends on December 26th. You can check out the collection for yourself and pledge your support by following the link in the description and the comments below. A big thank you to Wormwood for sponsoring this video. As always, the first step in painting was to prime, and for this I chose black. This was chosen to help create the dark shadows in the recesses and was applied via my airbrush, but feel free to apply your own primer in whatever way you prefer. To paint this model, I used parts from the Too Thin Coats range and started off with Cold Corpse Blue. This was used to paint the fatigues. Before application, it was thinned out a little with water and applied as instructed in 2 thin coats, allowing the first layer to dry fully before applying the second. This just ensured that a good solid base colour was applied. Now this is entirely optional, but I wanted to paint the model as though the light source was coming from the left side of the miniature. As such, the paint was focused in areas that face this direction, with the opposite sides being left a little darker to create the impression of shadows. This process was repeated with the next layer of Wolf Grey. Being a slightly lighter bluish grey than the base coat, it was applied as a mid-tone. Essentially, this means painting over the surfaces again, but leaving the deeper recesses as the darker base. Again, I followed the idea that light was emanating from the top left and applied my paint accordingly. The final steps were the highlights, and these were focused on only the raised edges and details. By applying a fine line of the lighter Gravestone Blue along these areas, it helped to accentuate the details and add greater depth to the model. Again, these highlights were more heavily applied to that left side. Finally, for the points of the model within direct light, some white star was mixed into Gravestone Blue. This extremely light blue was added to the corners and sharper edges. This added a degree of sharpness to the details, further bringing out that depth. For the armor and the gaiters, Wizard Grey was chosen for the base coat and applied in the same way as before. A couple of thin layers with particular emphasis being applied to the left side of the model. Carcharadon Grey was then used to build up the lightness a little with a few thin layers. In addition to this, some small scratches were also added to the armor in order to give the surface a little texture and that appearance of wear and tear. Finally, White Star was used as a final spot highlight. I wanted to give the leather a reddish brown hue in order to contrast against the cooler blues and greys already laid down. So, the various straps, pouches and boots were all given a base coat of Cuirass Leather. A layer of Boar Hide was then used as a layer, followed by an edge highlight of Fur Cloak. And finally, some small spots of Rust Orange were dotted onto the corners and the leather strap running across the left shoulder. To paint the claws and carapace armor on the wrist, I chose to go for a purple. Most of the colours being used on the model are quite natural tones, greys, browns and flesh tones, so having something a little brighter, a little more vibrant will help it to stand out. These areas were then layered with Sword Hilt Burgundy, before being highlighted first with Glistening Gums, and then extreme highlighted with a mixture of Glistening Gums and Ivory Tusk. The skin was approached in the usual way, at least for the first few layers. Barbarian Brawn was chosen as the base coat and applied in a few thin layers, again leaving the right side of the face a little darker than the left. Dwarven Skin was next and was used to lighten up some of the surfaces. But, rather than jumping straight into the highlights, I first wanted to give the skin a slightly more alien look and help to blend it into the purple carapace. To do this, a mixture of Glaze Medium and Glistening Gums was created. The result was a mixture that, when applied across the skin, subtly adjusted the colour, giving it a slight purple hue. This can be applied as many times as you want. Each layer will steadily and smoothly add that purple hue, creating a much more alien-looking skin tone. With the purple tone in place, the highlights could resume. First with Elven Skin, and then a little Elven Skin mixed in with some Trooper White. The next areas to tackle were the metals, but to just clean up a few of the overspills I'd made, I decided to neaten things up with some Doom Death Black. With everything cleaned up, the first base coat was created by mixing Doom Death Black and Surcoat Silver in order to create a dark gunmetal. This would just help the following layers of brighter silvers to stand out even further. Surcoat Silver on its own was then applied as a scratchy highlight. Again, I focused these highlights mainly towards the left side of the metal areas, helping to tie it in with the shading achieved on the rest of the model. Finally, the highlights were complemented with a little bit of the even brighter Mithril Blade. The gold of the icon was tackled in a similar way. The first base coat was formed from a mix of Dragon's Gold and Cuirass Leather, creating a dark and rich gold colour. Then, Dragon's Gold was layered on, leaving the darker mix still visible in those recesses. The gold was then finished off with an edge height of Glistening Gold. While the model was mostly complete, there were still a few extra details that could be added to the armour in the form of further damage and dirt. For both of these, I used some more Cuirass Leather. To deepen the scratches applied earlier, a fine line of reddish-brown was applied immediately adjacent to the existing scratches, giving them the appearance of depth. As well as the scratches, a glaze of Cuirass Leather was also created. This was applied over just the shaded areas of the armour. It not only gave the armour a dirtier appearance, but the warmer tone helped to contrast it against the cooler grey. To paint the skull on the base, I began with a base coat of Dragon Fang, followed by a layer of Skeleton Legion, before finishing off with a highlight of Vampire Fang. The only thing left to do now was to add a little ground texture to the base. For this, I opted to use some of AK Interactive's Lunar Desert to give the base the appearance of a blasted wasteland. This was layered up across the base to create some topography, but great care was taken not to get the paste onto the already painted parts of the model. Over this texture, another Cuirass Leather glaze was applied, building up the intensity towards the right side of the base where the shadows cast by the trooper would be. Then, to bring out the texture, some Carcharadon Grey was lightly dry brushed across the surface. This was followed by some Doom Death Black, which was used to clean up the rim of the base. Finally, a matte varnish was sprayed across the model, not only to seal in the paintwork, but to also tone down any glossiness. And with that, the model was complete, and I was left with this. And here we have the completed Genestealer Cult Guardsman. The techniques that I've used here can easily be mixed and matched across many of the new Astra Militarum kits to create some unique looking combinations. By adding a few Genestealer Cult parts, it will be quite straightforward to build an entire cult-controlled Astra Militarum force. If you enjoyed this Genestealer Corrupting Kitbash and have any suggestions for more cult conversions you'd like to see me tackle, then leave them down in the comments. For those of you looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with a few affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. Now before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Big Tom, Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.